There comes a moment in every parent's life when you realize you'd sacrifice everything to give your children a better future. For Mark Henderson, that moment came when he lost his job at 52 and faced eviction. Standing at the harbour, he stared at an abandoned cruise ship everyone said was worthless. His last $3,000 could cover rent for 2 months, or he could buy this rotting vessel at auction. His adult daughter begged him not to do it. His own brother wouldn't speak to him. But Mark saw something nobody else did. Hidden within that decaying ship was a discovery that would change everything. But what could possibly be worth risking everything he had left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mark Henderson had spent 30 years building things that mattered. As a maritime engineer, he designed offshore platforms that stood against hurricanes, calculated load-bearing specifications for container ships that crossed oceans, and consulted on harbor expansions from Seattle to Singapore. His hands knew the language of steel and salt water. His mind understood how structures held together under impossible pressure. But none of that expertise had prepared him for the phone call that came on a Tuesday morning in March. The company was downsizing, his position was being eliminated. At 52, with a resume full of accomplishments and a reputation for excellence, Mark discovered that experience had an expiration date in the modern economy. The severance package lasted 4 months. His savings, carefully built over decades, evaporated with alarming speed. Mortgage payments on the small house he'd bought after his wife died, insurance premiums, the property taxes that came due like clockwork, medical bills from Linda's emergency appendectomy 2 years prior that insurance hadn't fully covered. Each month, Mark watched his financial foundation crumble like rust on an old ship's hull. His daughter Linda taught 3rd grade across town. At 28, she'd built a life of her own, a small apartment, a reliable car, a career she loved. She'd inherited her mother's dedication and warmth, spending evenings grading papers and weekends planning lessons that made learning feel like adventure. Mark had raised her alone since she was 20, when cancer took his wife Claire in a matter of months. Those years had forged a bond between father and daughter that most people never experienced. But lately, that bond felt strained. Linda worried constantly. She offered to loan him money she didn't have. She suggested he move in with her, squeeze into her 1-bedroom apartment, give up the house that held every memory of her mother. Mark refused. A father didn't burden his children. A father found solutions. His brother Kenny called every few days with job leads that went nowhere. Kenny worked as an accountant, lived in a tidy suburban home with his wife and 2 teenagers, and approached life with spreadsheet logic. He'd never understood Mark's choice to stay in a field that required constant adaptation, that valued innovation over stability. Now, with Mark facing eviction, Kenny's advice came wrapped in judgment that stung more than Mark wanted to admit. "There's an opening at the county assessor's office," Kenny said during one call. "Data entry. It's not glamorous, but it's steady." Mark thanked him and didn't apply. At 52, with 3 decades of engineering expertise, he couldn't imagine sitting in a cubicle, entering numbers into a database. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper, a refusal to accept that his best years were behind him. The eviction notice arrived on a Friday, 30 days to vacate. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the paper trembling in his hands, and felt something break inside him. Not panic, exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous. The surrender that comes when a man realizes he's lost control of his own story. That weekend, he walked. Miles along the waterfront, past the commercial docks and fishing boats, through the neighborhoods where old houses leaned against each other like tired friends. He found himself at Port Clayton, the industrial harbor where decommissioned vessels went to die or be reborn, cargo ships in for repairs, fishing trawlers being retrofitted, and at the far end of the dock, a massive cruise ship that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The Empress Catherine. Even from a distance, Mark could see the rust bleeding down her white hull, the missing windows, the gangway chained and locked. But he could also see her lines, the elegant sweep of her superstructure, the proportions that spoke of an era when ships were built to impress as much as to transport. His engineer's eye traced her bones beneath the decay, and he saw something the casual observer would miss. She was sound. Neglected, yes, but structurally solid in ways that mattered. A faded auction notice was stapled to the fence. Public sale the following Tuesday. Minimum bid, $2,500. Sold as is, no warranties. Buyer responsible for all costs and liabilities. Mark stood there for an hour as the sun set over the water, painting the rusty ship in shades of gold and orange. He thought about Claire, who'd always believed in following instincts even when logic argued otherwise. She'd been the dreamer in their marriage, the one who saw possibilities instead of obstacles. "The universe sends us opportunities," she used to say. "Most people are too afraid to recognize them." On Tuesday morning, Mark drove to the county auction house with a cashier's check for $3,000, everything left in his account after the final bills were paid. The auction room held maybe 20 people, most of them looking bored or skeptical. A few commercial salvage operators leafed through their catalogues. A couple of scrap metal dealers whispered calculations. When the auctioneer announced the Empress Catherine, the room went silent except for scattered laughter. "Folks, I won't sugarcoat this one," the auctioneer said. "She's a project. Been sitting at that dock for 11 years. Harbour Authority wants her gone. Opening bid is $2,500. Do I hear 25? Mark raised his card. The auctioneer looked surprised. $2,500 to bidder 42. Do I hear 3,000? Silence. The salvage operators weren't interested in anything that big. The scrap dealers had calculated that cutting her up would cost more than the metal was worth. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder 42 for $2,500. Mark walked out with a bill of sale, a set of keys that looked older than his daughter, and the strange lightness that comes from burning your last bridge. He'd spent $200 less than he'd brought, which meant he had $500 to his name and owned a derelict cruise ship. Linda's reaction was exactly what he'd expected. She came to the house that evening, still in her teaching clothes, and stood in the kitchen with tears streaming down her face. "Dad, what did you do? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I've spent my entire career understanding ships," Mark said quietly. "And that ship is worth more than people realize. It's a pile of rust. You just spent your last money on something that's probably going to cost millions to make useful. We're about to lose this house, and you bought a boat?" "A ship," Mark corrected gently, "and I know it looks crazy, but trust me, Linda, please. I've never asked you to trust me blindly, but I'm asking now." She left angry, and Mark didn't blame her. He sat alone in the house that night, surrounded by boxes he'd started packing, and wondered if he'd finally lost his mind. But Wednesday morning he drove to Port Clayton with a toolbox, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. The harbour master, an old sailor named Gus Pemberton, met him at the gate. "You're the fool who bought the Catherine?" Gus asked, not unkindly. "That's me." "Well, you've got more guts than sense. But I'll give you this, she was something special once. My father worked on her crew back in the 50s. Said she was the finest ship he ever served on." Gus handed Mark a rusted key. "This opens the main deck access. Watch your step. I haven't been aboard in years, and she's not exactly up to code anymore." Mark climbed the gangway alone, his boots echoing on the metal grating. The main deck spread before him like a ghost town, empty pools filled with rainwater, deck chairs turned to skeletons of rust and rotted canvas, windows dark as dead eyes. But beneath the neglect, Mark saw what his experience had trained him to recognize. The deck plates were solid. The superstructure showed surface rust, but no structural compromise. The ship had good bones. He spent the day exploring, taking notes, assessing systems. By evening, he stood at the bow and watched the sun set over Port Clayton. His phone rang. "Linda, I'm still angry," she said, "but I Googled the ship. The Empress Catherine was famous once. She carried movie stars and presidents." "I know," Mark said softly. "There are people online who remember her. They're talking about you buying her. Some of them think you're crazy, but some of them are curious. What do you think?" A long pause. "I think Mom would tell you to follow your instinct, so I'm going to try to trust that. But Dad, please tell me you have a plan." Mark looked down at the deck beneath his feet, at the brass nameplate that read Empress Catherine 1949, and felt something stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to give up that had carried him through his wife's death and the years of raising Linda alone. "I'm working on one," he said. That night, Mark slept in his car in the Port Clayton parking lot, too tired to drive home. He dreamed of Claire, who smiled at him and said nothing, just placed her hand over his heart the way she used to when she wanted him to listen to his own wisdom. Mark's first full day of serious exploration began with coffee from a thermos and a methodical plan. He'd spent 30 years learning how to approach complex engineering problems, and this ship was simply another puzzle waiting to be solved. Start with the structural essentials, document everything, work from the top down. The bridge came first. 7 flights of exterior stairs, each one tested carefully before trusting his full weight. The door to the wheelhouse hung open, hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the space looked frozen in time. Dust covered everything in a thick grey blanket, but beneath it, Mark found equipment that told stories. The ship's wheel, brass and teak, still solid. Navigation instruments from an era before GPS, their glass faces clouded but intact, charts rolled and forgotten in cubbyholes. He worked through the bridge systematically, opening drawers and cabinets, finding ship's documents, yellow with age, maintenance logs from the 1950 seconds, radio equipment that belonged in a museum. The view from the bridge windows showed Port Clayton spread out below, fishing boats coming and going, containers being loaded onto cargo ships, the ordinary commerce of a working harbour. His ship felt separated from all that activity, suspended in its own timeline. The officers' quarters were located 1 deck below. Mark forced open doors swollen with moisture and found small cabins stripped of anything valuable. Mattresses rotted down to springs, lockers empty except for rust stains. But at the end of the corridor, 1 door resisted his attempts to open it. The lock had fused with corrosion. It took 20 minutes with a pry bar and penetrating oil before the door finally surrendered. The seal that broke released air that smelled of old leather and cedar, as if the room had been holding its breath for decades. Mark stepped inside and stopped. The captain's quarters were pristine. Not clean. Exactly, dust lay thick on every surface but untouched. A large cabin with wooden panelling, built-in furniture of dark mahogany, brass fixtures gone green with age. A desk sat beneath portholes that overlooked the harbour. Bookshelves lined 1 wall, still holding volumes on navigation, maritime law, and, surprisingly, art history. A narrow bed with a wool blanket folded at its foot. Everything arranged as if the captain had simply stepped out and never returned. Mark moved through the space with reverence, aware he was probably the first person to enter in more than a decade. He opened the desk drawers carefully, personal effects mostly, a pipe and tobacco tin, photographs of the ship in its glory days, white paint gleaming, passengers in formal attire crowding the decks. Letters bundled with string, the handwriting faded beyond legibility. The bottom drawer stuck. Mark worked it gently, not wanting to force anything, until it slid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound book. He lifted it out carefully and unwrapped it on the desk. A logbook. Captain's personal log. The title page read, in elegant script, "The Empress Catherine 1950 to to 1958. Mark sat down in the captain's chair, which creaked under his weight but held, and began to read. The entries started routine weather observations, course headings, passenger manifests, but as he turned pages, patterns emerged. References to special cargo and private arrangements, notes about sealed compartments prepared for the owner's collections. Mentions of a Preston Blackwell, who apparently wasn't just a passenger, but the ship's owner from 1955 onward. The entries grew more cryptic in the later years. Per Mr. Blackwell's instructions, forward holds sealed and secured. Owner's private quarters prepared per specifications, additional modifications to lower deck. Received manifest for secure storage items logged separately as requested. The final entry was dated the 15th of March, 1958. Owner has not returned as scheduled. Ship to remain at dock pending further instruction. All secure holds to remain sealed per standing orders. Nothing after that. Just blank pages. Mark read through the log twice, his engineer's mind catching details others might miss. This ship had been modified, deliberately altered to hide or protect something. The owner's collections, whatever they were, had been important enough to justify structural changes. He checked his watch. Almost 4 o'clock. Linda would be finishing her school day. Mark pulled out his phone and called her. "Dad, how's the rust bucket?" "Linda, I found something. A logbook. The ship's history." Mark heard the excitement in his own voice and tried to moderate it. This vessel wasn't just a cruise ship. She was privately owned, and there are references to sealed compartments. Hidden spaces. Hidden spaces for what? That's what I need to figure out. But the owner was named Preston Blackwell. Does that name mean anything to you? Should it? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. After hanging up, Mark took photographs of key logbook pages with his phone. The light was fading, and he needed to get home, or what remained of home, for another 3 weeks. But as he secured the captain's quarters, he noticed Gus Pemberton climbing the exterior stairs. "Wondered if you were still aboard," Gus said, slightly winded from the climb. "Saw your car still in the lot. Just finishing up. Found something interesting." Mark showed him the logbook. Gus's weathered face creased with recognition. "Preston Blackwell. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in 50 years. My father used to talk about him. Rich man, owned factories or something. Bought this ship and turned her into his private yacht, basically. Took trips all over the world. What happened to him? Disappeared. 1958. Maybe 59. Story was, he went overboard during a storm. Body never recovered. The ship sat at dock, waiting for someone to claim her, but nobody did. Eventually, the harbour authority took possession for unpaid fees. She's been bouncing between owners ever since, nobody willing to invest in restoration. Mark absorbed this information. The logbook mentions sealed compartments. "Do you know anything about that?" Gus scratched his jaw. "There were always rumours. My father said Blackwell was paranoid about theft, had the ship modified with hidden spaces. Some folks claimed he kept treasure aboard, but that's probably just sailor talk. You know how stories grow." "Maybe," Mark said. "But I'm going to find out." That evening, back in his nearly empty house, Mark spent hours researching online. Preston Blackwell had indeed been wealthy, an industrialist who made his fortune in steel manufacturing and shipping. He'd purchased the Empress Catherine in 1955 and reportedly spent millions customizing her. Society pages from the era showed him hosting elaborate parties aboard the ship, entertaining celebrities and politicians. His disappearance in 1958 had made headlines briefly. The official story was death at sea, though his body was never found. His business empire had been divided among various heirs and partners. The ship, apparently, had been overlooked in the distribution of assets. Mark created a folder on his laptop with everything he could find. Photographs of Blackwell, a lean man with sharp eyes and an enigmatic smile. articles about his business dealings, maritime records showing the Empress Catherine's voyages, and most intriguing, a brief mention in a 1957 magazine article about Blackwell's private collection of rare maritime artifacts and historical navigation instruments. Collection, the word from the logbook, owner's collections. Mark sat back and stared at the photograph of the ship in her glory days. Somewhere inside that rusting hull were spaces that hadn't been opened in decades. Spaces that might contain whatever Preston Blackwell had valued enough to hide. He thought about his dwindling bank account, the eviction notice, Linda's worried face. He thought about Kenny's judgment and the sensible choice of steady employment. He thought about Claire's voice saying, "The universe sends opportunities." Then Mark opened his notebook and began sketching a search plan. Tomorrow, he'd bring proper tools and start looking for those sealed compartments. Because if there was even a chance that something valuable remained aboard the Empress Catherine, he was going to find it. His phone buzzed. A text from Linda. "I'm coming by the ship tomorrow after school. Want to see what you found." Mark smiled. It was a start. Mark arrived at the ship before dawn, his truck loaded with equipment borrowed from former colleagues who'd heard about his purchase with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Portable work lights, extension cords, a generator that coughed to life after 3 pulls. He'd also brought camping gear, a sleeping bag, portable stove, basic supplies. The house would be gone in 2 weeks. He might as well make the ship his home. The logbook had become his Bible. He'd read it cover to cover 3 more times, making notes and cross-referencing the ship's official blueprints he'd found in the County Maritime Archives. Standard cruise ship layout, nothing unusual. But the captain's references to modifications suggested the official plans were incomplete. He set up work lights in the first-class lounge, a grand space that must have been spectacular once. Curved walls with Art Deco moulding, a bar with a mirrored back wall, built-in seating along the portholes. Everything water-stained and peeling now. But the bones were elegant. Mark studied the walls, tapping panels, looking for inconsistencies. The captain's log mentioned sealed spaces near passenger areas, accessible but concealed. He worked methodically, section by section, until his knuckles landed on a panel that sounded different, hollow. 20 minutes with a pry bar revealed a hidden compartment about 3 feet wide, running floor to ceiling behind decorative moulding. Inside, mounted on brackets, was a rolled bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord that disintegrated at his touch. Mark carried it to a cleared table and carefully unwrapped it. Architectural blueprints, hand-drawn in ink on heavy paper. The title block read, "Private Modifications, the Empress Catherine 1955, Preston Blackwell, owner." His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled them. These weren't the official plans. These showed modifications, hidden compartments throughout the ship, accessible through concealed panels and false walls. Someone had designed an entire secret geography within the vessel. Mark spent 2 hours studying the drawings, comparing them to what he'd already explored. At least a dozen hidden spaces marked, some small, others substantial. The drawings showed access points, dimensions, even notes about climate control in certain areas. A sound on the gangway made him look up. Linda appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 coffee cups and a paper bag. "Thought you might need breakfast," she said. "It's Saturday, in case you forgot what day it is." "Did I?" Mark accepted the coffee gratefully. Linda looked around the lounge, taking in the work lights and camping gear. "Are you living here now?" Seemed practical. The house needs to be cleared out anyway. She sat down across from him, noticed the blueprints. "What are those?" Mark explained about the hidden compartment, the modified plans. Linda leaned over the drawings, her teacher's mind organizing information. So this Blackwell person basically turned the ship into a giant safe. Looks that way. These blueprints show where everything is hidden. It's like having a treasure map. "Have you found anything else yet?" "Not yet. I wanted to wait until you got here. Something in Linda's expression softened. You waited for me. This is your adventure too, if you want it to be. They worked together through the morning, following the blueprints to locate hidden spaces. Most were empty, whatever had been stored there removed or never placed. But in the navigation room, behind a panel marked on the drawings, they found another sealed compartment. This one required careful work. The panel had been screwed and sealed professionally. Mark drilled out the corroded screws while Linda held the work light steady. When the panel finally came free, they both peered inside. A wooden crate, about 2 feet long, sat on a shelf built into the wall. Stenciled on its side were maritime symbols and the words, "Fragile Scientific Instrument." Mark lifted it out carefully. It weighed perhaps 10 pounds. He set it on the navigator's table and used a flathead screwdriver to gently pry up the lid. Inside, nested in custom-cut foam that had survived remarkably well, was an antique sextant. Even tarnished, its beauty was evident: brass and silver construction, intricate engravings, a wooden handle of rich mahogany. Linda let out a small gasp. "Is that real?" Mark examined it carefully, found an inscription on the base. HMS Challenger Expedition 1872. The Challenger expedition was one of the first major scientific ocean surveys, Mark said quietly. This would have been used to navigate and map uncharted waters. If it's authentic, it's museum quality. How much would it be worth? I don't know. Thousands, certainly. Maybe tens of thousands. Mark set it down gently. But more than the money, this proves that Blackwell really did have a collection. And if he went to this much trouble to hide a sextant, what else is here? They spent the rest of the day systematically checking locations marked on the blueprints. Most compartments were empty, but they found other items: maritime charts from the early 1900s, a ship's chronometer that no longer worked, pieces of scrimshaw. Nothing as significant as the sextant, but each discovery built their excitement. By late afternoon, word had spread through Port Clayton that Mark had found something valuable. Gus appeared with a friend from the Historical Society, a woman named Irene Walsh, who examined the sextant with expert hands and barely contained enthusiasm. "This is extraordinary," Irene said. "We need to authenticate it properly, but if this is genuine, and I believe it is, you've found something historically significant. May I photograph it for our records?" Mark agreed. Irene spent an hour documenting the sextant and the other items, asking questions about where they'd been found. Preston Blackwell's collection was legendary in certain circles, she explained. He was known to acquire rare maritime artifacts, but after his disappearance, most people assumed the collection had been sold off or lost. If even part of it is still aboard this ship, you're sitting on a historical treasure. After Irene left, promising to research the items and return with more information, Mark and Linda sat on the deck, watching the sun set. "Dad, you realize what this means?" Linda said. "You weren't crazy. Well, maybe a little crazy, but you were right. One sextant doesn't solve our problems. No, but it proves there might be more. And even if there isn't, this one piece could be worth enough to—" She paused. "To what? What are you going to do if you find a whole collection?" Mark considered the question. "Honestly, I don't know yet. Part of me says, sell everything, secure our future. But another part thinks about why Blackwell hid these things. He valued them. Maybe they shouldn't just be turned into cash. That's very noble, but we're about to be homeless. I know. But let's see what else is here first. Then we'll decide." His phone rang. "Kenny's name on the screen," Mark answered. "I heard a rumor you found something valuable on that wreck," Kenny said without preamble. "News travels fast. Mark, listen. If you've actually found something worth money, you need to be smart about this. Get proper appraisals, understand the tax implications, maybe set up an LLC for liability protection." It was the first conversation with his brother that didn't carry judgment. Mark felt something unclench in his chest. Of course, you're still an idiot for buying a ship, but if you're going to be an idiot, at least be a smart one about the business side. After hanging up, Mark smiled. Linda noticed. Kenny coming around? Maybe. One sextant at a time. That night, Mark slept in the captain's quarters, his sleeping bag laid out on the floor. The ship creaked and groaned around him, metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes, water lapping against the hull. But the sounds felt comforting rather than ominous. The Empress, Catherine, was speaking to him, welcoming him into her secrets. Tomorrow they'd continue the search. But tonight, for the first time since losing his job, Mark felt something other than desperation. He felt purpose. The blueprints had marked a compartment in what the drawings labelled Owner's Navigation Study, a private room adjacent to the chart room. Mark had walked past the door 3 times without recognizing it as anything special. It looked like a maintenance closet, painted the same institutional beige as the corridor walls. But the modified plans showed something different. Behind that door was a space twice the size it appeared, with a false wall concealing a climate-controlled vault. Mark studied the drawings for an hour before attempting entry, wanting to understand the mechanism. The false wall was designed to slide on hidden tracks, activated by removing specific decorative panels in a particular sequence. Elegant engineering from an era when craftsmanship mattered more than cost. Linda arrived mid-morning with sandwiches and the news that she'd taken a personal day from school. I told my principal I had a family emergency, she said, which is sort of true. My father is having an emergency involving a possibly valuable ship. I appreciate the support, even if the description is accurate. They worked together following the blueprint instructions. Remove the upper left panel, then the lower right. Finally, a center medallion that looked purely decorative. Behind it, a lever. Mark pulled it. Somewhere inside the wall, old mechanisms groaned. Then, with a sound like a sigh, a section of wall slid sideways, revealing darkness beyond. Mark shone his flashlight into the opening. A narrow passage led to what appeared to be a small room. They entered carefully, Mark testing each step. The space was maybe 8 feet square, walls lined with custom-built shelving, and on those shelves, wrapped in protective cloth, were shapes that made Mark's pulse quicken. The first package he unwrapped contained a rolled cylinder of heavy paper. He carried it to the chart room, where there was space to examine it properly. When he unrolled it, both he and Linda leaned close. A navigation chart, hand-drawn and annotated, showing polar regions. In the corner, signatures. Ernest Shackleton, Commander. Frank Worsley, Navigator, dated 1914. This is from Shackleton's Antarctic expedition, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Endurance voyage. Linda's hands hovered over the chart, not quite touching. Is that really his signature? We'll need Irene to confirm, but it looks authentic. Mark photographed it carefully before rolling it back up. There were more charts in the hidden room, maps of Arctic routes signed by explorers Mark recognized from history books, Pacific crossing routes from the Age of Sail, each one a piece of maritime history preserved in this forgotten space. But the most impressive discovery came in a sealed case at the back of the vault. Inside were navigation charts from famous expeditions, Amundsen's Northwest Passage, Cook's Pacific voyages, routes mapped by explorers whose names belonged in textbooks. Linda sat down on the floor of the passage, overwhelmed. Dad, these aren't just valuable, they're historically important. I know. What are we going to do? Before Mark could answer, voices echoed from the main deck, footsteps on the stairs. Gus appeared with Irene, who'd brought 2 colleagues from the Historical Society. When Irene saw the charts spread across the chart room table, her professional composure cracked. She stood silent for a long moment, then picked up her phone. I need to call the Maritime Museum director. Today. Right now. The next hours blurred together. More people arrived, appraisers, historians, a representative from a maritime auction house who'd driven 3 hours after hearing rumours. Mark found himself giving tours, explaining the discovery process, answering questions he barely understood himself. The auction house representative, a distinguished man named Philip Cornerstone, examined the charts with white gloves and expert eyes. "Mr. Henderson, I need to be direct with you. This collection, just what you've found so far, is worth considerable money. 6 figures, certainly. The Shackleton chart alone could bring 80 to 100,000 at auction. If you have more items of this caliber, you're looking at a very different financial situation than when you bought this vessel." Mark glanced at Linda, saw his own shock reflected in her face. "However," Philip continued, "you need to proceed carefully. Authentication, provenance, legal verification of ownership. The fact that Preston Blackwell owned these doesn't automatically transfer ownership to you, depending on how his estate was settled. You'll need legal counsel." Kenny arrived that evening, summoned by Linda. He listened to the situation with his accountant's focus, taking notes. "First thing tomorrow, we get you a lawyer who specializes in maritime law and estate issues. Second, we document everything meticulously. Third, we secure this ship properly. If word gets out about the value here, you could have problems." "What kind of problems?" Linda asked. "Theft, for one. Legal challenges from Blackwell's heirs, if any exist. Tax implications. Insurance requirements." Kenny looked at Mark. "You just went from broke to potentially wealthy, but there's a lot of complicated steps between here and actually having usable money." That night, Mark hired a security company to watch the ship. It cost money he didn't have, charged to a credit card he'd been avoiding using. But Kenny was right. The risk was too great. The local news picked up the story. By the next day, Mark's phone wouldn't stop ringing, collectors wanting to make offers, journalists requesting interviews, curiosity seekers showing up at the dock. Mark agreed to one interview with the local television station, partly to control the narrative, partly because Irene convinced him it would generate interest in preserving the ship's history. The reporter, a young woman with careful questions, asked him how it felt to go from facing eviction to discovering treasure. "Strange," Mark admitted. "A week ago, I was wondering how to keep my daughter's world stable. Now I'm trying to figure out what responsibility comes with finding pieces of history. What will you do with the money if you sell the collection?" Mark looked past the camera to where Linda stood watching. "Secure my family's future first. But beyond that, I'm not sure yet. These items were important enough for Preston Blackwell to hide and protect. Maybe they deserve more than just being turned into cash." After the interview, Linda hugged him. "Mum would be proud of how you're handling this. Your mother would tell me to stop overthinking and enjoy the moment." That too. Gus found Mark on the deck later, watching the sunset. Word around the harbour is that collectors are already making offers. Serious money. Philip suggested I wait, do proper authentication, maybe auction the items properly. Probably smart. But Mark, can I give you some advice from an old sailor? Please, don't let the money change what you saw when you first looked at this ship. You didn't buy her to get rich. You bought her because you saw something worth saving. Remember that when people start throwing numbers around." Mark nodded slowly. "There's still more to find. The blueprints show other sealed compartments. Then you keep looking. But remember, the biggest treasure might not be what's hidden in the walls, might be what you're building here." Your daughter's eyes lit up when she talked about the discoveries. Your brother's helping instead of judging. This community's getting excited about their maritime history again. That's worth something too. After Gus left, Mark returned to the captain's quarters. The logbook lay on the desk where he'd left it. He flipped through the pages again, looking for clues about what else might be hidden. One entry caught his eye. Owner requested special vault preparation in lower deck, said it's for the crown jewel of his collection. Reinforced compartment completed per specifications. Crown jewel. Something more important than the charts and sextant. Something that required its own reinforced vault. Mark studied the blueprints again with fresh eyes. There, in the lower deck plan, a compartment marked simply Primary Secure Storage. He hadn't searched there yet. The lower deck compartment required engineering expertise Mark was grateful to possess. According to the blueprints, it sat beneath the original first-class dining room, accessible through a concealed hatch hidden under what appeared to be decorative flooring. But 60 years of neglect meant the floor had warped. Water damage had weakened support beams. Before Mark could even think about opening the compartment, he needed to ensure the structure wouldn't collapse under him. He spent 3 days with jacks and temporary supports, reinforcing the dining room floor. Linda came after school each day, learning to hand him tools and hold flashlights. Kenny stopped by with legal documents from the maritime attorney he'd hired, papers establishing Mark's clear ownership of the ship and everything aboard it, assuming no legitimate claims emerged from Blackwell's estate. The lawyer says Blackwell's business was dissolved in 1960, Kenny explained. His heirs claimed industrial assets, but apparently nobody knew about the ship's contents. As long as you document everything properly, it should be clean. Irene brought news that the Shackleton chart had been authenticated by experts at the National Maritime Museum. They're calling it one of the most significant finds in recent maritime history, she said. Mark, you understand what this means? Museums will want these items. Private collectors will pay extraordinary amounts. You're going to have to make serious decisions. But Mark's attention remained focused on the hidden compartment. If Blackwell had called something his crown jewel, Mark wanted to know what it was before making any decisions about selling. On the 4th day, with supports in place and safety measures checked twice, Mark began removing the decorative floor panels. Linda and Gus watched as he worked, the 3 of them alone aboard ship in the early morning quiet. The hatch revealed itself slowly, a circular opening with a wheel lock, like a ship's watertight door but smaller. The wheel was frozen with corrosion. That's not budging without some serious encouragement, Gus observed. Mark applied penetrating oil, let it soak, then used a pipe wrench for leverage. The wheel resisted, groaned, then suddenly broke free. He spun it counterclockwise until it stopped. The hatch lifted with surprising ease, well balanced despite its age. Below was darkness and a ladder leading down perhaps 8 feet. "I'll go first," Mark said. "Be careful." Linda's voice carried an edge of worry. Mark descended slowly, testing each rung. At the bottom, his boots found solid decking. He clicked on his flashlight. The compartment was small, maybe 6 feet by 8, with reinforced walls. Climate-controlled once, though the equipment had long since failed. And along one wall, built-in cabinets with glass doors. Inside those cabinets, carefully mounted on display stands, were instruments that made Mark's breath catch. Navigation equipment from different eras, astrolabes, octants, sextants of various designs. But these weren't ordinary instruments. Each was extraordinary in craftsmanship or historical significance. "What do you see?" Linda called from above. "History," Mark said quietly. "A lot of it." He climbed back up and helped Linda down. Together they examined the collection by flashlight. A brass astrolabe with Arabic inscriptions, a sextant made of ivory and ebony, an octant that appeared to be from the 1700s. But the centerpiece sat alone in its own case, a marine chronometer in a mahogany box, its brass works visible through a glass face. A small plaque read, "After John Harrison's design, 1761. John Harrison solved the longitude problem," Mark explained to Linda. "His chronometers allowed sailors to determine their position at sea accurately for the first time. This is based on his original design. If it's authentic, it's priceless from a historical standpoint." Linda touched the glass case gently. This is what Blackwell called his crown jewel? Maybe. Or maybe there's more. They spent hours cataloguing what they found. Each piece represented a breakthrough in maritime navigation, carefully preserved and protected. Mark photographed everything, documented locations, handled each item with reverence. When they finally surfaced, Irene was waiting with two museum curators she'd called in. The curators descended into the compartment and emerged an hour later looking stunned. "Mr. Henderson," the senior curator said, "you need to understand what you have here. This isn't just a collection. This is a comprehensive history of maritime navigation. Some of these pieces are unique. The chronometer alone could be worth $200,000 or more. The entire collection could exceed $1 million. The number felt unreal. Mark had gone from $3,000 to his name to potential millions in 3 weeks. That evening, collectors began making serious offers. Phone calls came from auction houses, private buyers, museums. A representative from Sotheby's flew in from New York. The attention became overwhelming. Kenny helped field inquiries, but even he seemed dazed by the amounts being discussed. "Mark, people are offering 7 figures for the entire collection. You need to think seriously about this." "I am thinking about it." "And?" Mark looked around the ship that had become his home. "I keep wondering why Blackwell hid all this. He could have sold these pieces, made money from them, but he chose to protect them, preserve them. Maybe there was a reason." Linda joined the conversation. "Dad, I support whatever you decide, but Kenny's right. This money could change our lives completely. My student loans, your retirement, everything we've worried about, it all goes away." "I know. Just give me a few days to think." Those days brought more discoveries. Mark sold some of the duplicate items, charts that had similar examples in museums, instruments that, while valuable, weren't unique. Those sales alone brought in enough money to pay off his debts, cover several months of expenses, and set up a proper bank account. But the most significant pieces, the Harrison chronometer, the rare astrolabes, the Shackleton chart, those he held back. Irene visited with a proposition. "The Historical Society wants to help you do something meaningful with this ship. We've been talking to the city council. What if the Empress Catherine became a museum, a maritime heritage center? That would require massive investment, restoration, maintenance, staff. The collection you've found could fund it. Keep some pieces here as permanent exhibits, sell others to establish an endowment. The ship becomes a living museum, educating people about maritime history." The idea resonated with something deep in Mark's chest. He thought about Claire's belief in purpose over profit, about Linda's students who deserve to learn history through real artifacts, about Gus's stories of when ships were built with pride and sailed with courage. That night, Mark gathered Linda and Kenny on the ship's deck. The 3 of them sat watching stars emerge over Port Clayton. "I want to tell you what I'm thinking," Mark began, "and I need your honest opinions." He laid out Irene's proposal, expanded it with his own ideas. Sell some pieces to establish financial security and create an endowment. Keep the most significant items as the foundation for a maritime museum. Transform the Empress, Catherine herself, into the main exhibit, a ship from the golden age of ocean travel, preserved and open to the public. Kenny listened carefully. "It's ambitious, risky even, but it could work financially if you structure it right." Linda was quiet for a long moment. Finally she said, "Mum always told me you saw things other people missed. I think you're doing it again. Not just seeing a ship, but seeing what it could mean to people." "So you think I should do it?" "I think you should follow your heart," Linda said. "Like you did when you bought this ship in the first place. That worked out pretty well." Mark smiled in the darkness. The decision was made. The city council meeting drew a crowd that surprised everyone. Port Clayton residents filled the chamber, spilling into the hallway. Mark hadn't expected this level of interest, but Irene had spread the word carefully. The community sensed something important was happening. Mark presented his proposal simply: transform the Empress Catherine into a maritime museum and heritage center, display the artifacts discovered aboard, create educational programs for schools, offer the ship as a community resource, a connection to the harbor's history. The funding would come from selling select pieces from the collection, enough to establish security and create an endowment. The most significant items would remain as permanent exhibits. Mark would donate the ship itself to a non-profit trust, retaining lifetime residence in the captain's quarters. Council members asked thoughtful questions. Cost projections. Kenny presented detailed spreadsheets. Educational value. Linda described potential programs for students. Historical significance. Irene gave a presentation about Port Clayton's maritime heritage that left several council members wiping their eyes. The vote was unanimous. The Empress Catherine would become a public landmark, protected and preserved. Afterward, people approached Mark with memories of the ship from decades past. An elderly woman remembered seeing it in the harbor as a child. A retired merchant marine talked about vessels from that era. A teacher asked when school groups could visit. The next weeks blurred into constant activity. Mark hired a restoration contractor recommended by Gus. The work would take months, but planning began immediately. Structural assessment, safety upgrades, accessibility improvements. Kenny established the non-profit structure, naming it the Blackwell Maritime Heritage Foundation in acknowledgement of the collection's origin. Irene became historical director. Gus signed on as operations volunteer, refusing salary but accepting the title. Linda surprised Mark by requesting a leave of absence from her teaching position. "I want to develop the educational programs," she explained. "Create something meaningful. This feels important, Dad." The auction of selected pieces brought astonishing results. The duplicate navigation charts sold for over $400,000. A sextant, similar to others in the collection, brought $60,000. Smaller instruments found eager buyers among collectors who appreciated their chance to own pieces of maritime history. Mark kept careful records, invested conservatively, established the endowment Kenny recommended. For the first time in his adult life, he had genuine financial security. But money wasn't what occupied his thoughts as restoration progressed. He spent hours planning exhibit spaces, imagining how visitors would move through the ship, what stories each room would tell. In the first-class dining room, they would display the navigation instruments with explanations of how each revolutionized sea travel. The chart room would house the historic maps, showing how explorers gradually mapped the world. The captain's quarters would remain exactly as Mark found them, a time capsule of 1,950 seconds maritime life. One afternoon, while contractors worked on climate control systems, Mark returned to the hidden vault where the chronometer had been stored. He wanted to measure for proper display cases. In the back corner, his flashlight caught something he'd missed before. A small compartment, no more than a foot square, concealed behind what he'd assumed was solid wall. The seam was barely visible. He worked it open carefully. Inside was a wooden box, simple and unadorned. Mark lifted it out and carried it to better light. The box was locked, but age had weakened the mechanism. It opened with gentle pressure. Inside, cushioned in velvet, was a brass compass. Not ornate or obviously valuable, just a working ship's compass, well-made but utilitarian. On the back, an engraving, True North, P.B. Beneath the compass was a folded letter, yellowed but intact. Mark unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but legible. "To whoever finds this collection," it began, "I am Preston Blackwell, and I am a coward." Mark read slowly, the letter detailing Blackwell's confession. He'd made his fortune legitimately, but had gotten involved in art smuggling schemes to increase his wealth. When authorities began investigating, he'd panicked. The hidden compartments weren't just for protection, They were preparation for flight. I staged my death, the letter continued, and fled to South America. The artifacts in this collection are legitimately acquired and legally mine, but I can never return to claim them without facing prosecution for my other crimes, so they remain here, hidden, a fortune I cannot touch. The letter ended with surprising reflection. Perhaps someone honest will find these someday, someone who will appreciate their value beyond money. I spent my life chasing wealth and lost everything that mattered. If you're reading this, I hope you're wiser than I was. True north isn't found in gold or treasure. It's found in purpose and integrity. Keep the compass to remember that. Mark sat for a long time with the letter and compass. He thought about Blackwell, dying somewhere far from home, separated from everything he'd valued. A man who'd had everything and lost it through poor choices. Then he thought about his own journey. Buying a ship everyone called worthless, risking everything on instinct and hope, finding treasures, yes, but more importantly, finding purpose. He showed the letter to Linda that evening. She read it twice. That's incredibly sad. He had all this beautiful collection and couldn't enjoy it. He made choices that trapped him, but his loss became our opportunity. Strange how things work out. What will you do with the compass? Keep it. Put it in the museum with his letter. Let people learn from his mistakes as much as from his collection. Over the following weeks, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. Irene found records showing Blackwell had died in Argentina in 1962, alone and using an assumed name. His legitimate business assets had been distributed, but nobody knew about the ship's contents because he'd never told anyone. His daughter still lived, it turned out, a woman in her 70s who'd spent her life believing her father drowned when she was 12. Irene contacted her carefully, explained what had been found. The response came by letter. She was grateful to know the truth, painful as it was. She had no legal claim to the collection and wouldn't pursue one, but she asked if she might visit when the museum opened. Of course, Mark wrote back. Your father's collection will help educate and inspire people. That's a legacy worth honoring, separate from his mistakes. As opening day approached, local media coverage increased. The story resonated. Single father risks everything, finds treasure, creates community resource. Television crews filmed restoration work. Newspapers ran features about maritime history and the artifacts being preserved. Mark gave interviews reluctantly, always emphasizing the team effort. Irene's knowledge, Kenny's business sense, Linda's educational vision, Gus's practical wisdom. The ship was becoming something larger than any individual. One evening, Mark stood on deck watching the sun set. The restoration was nearly complete. Fresh paint gleamed white and blue. Windows sparkled. The brass nameplate shone. Linda joined him. Nervous about opening day? A little. What if nobody comes? She laughed. Dad, we've sold advance tickets to 300 people. The first week is completely booked. Still seems unreal. 2 months ago I was facing eviction, and now you're creating something that will last beyond both our lifetimes. Mom would be proud. Mark touched the compass in his pocket, the simple brass instrument Blackwell had labelled True North. He'd found his direction, not in treasure or wealth, but in purpose and community. Tomorrow would be the grand opening. Tonight, he was simply grateful for second chances and the courage to take them. The discovery came 3 days before the scheduled opening, during a final walkthrough with the fire marshal. Mark was showing the safety improvements when the inspector commented on an unusual thickness in one section of wall. Building code doesn't require walls this thick, he noted. Seems excessive even for a ship. Mark hadn't paid attention to that particular wall before. It was in the original owner's suite, a space they designated for administrative offices. He studied it with fresh eyes, then pulled out the modified blueprints he'd come to know intimately. The blueprints showed that wall as standard thickness. After the inspector left, Mark measured carefully. The wall was indeed a foot thicker than indicated on Blackwell's secret plans, which meant either the plans were wrong or there was something even Blackwell's modifications hadn't shown. He spent 2 hours examining the wall from every angle before finding it a hairline seam hidden behind trim work, not a sliding panel like the others. This was a door, cleverly concealed, that required specific pressure points to release. Mark worked the mechanism carefully. When it finally opened, he found himself looking into a small private cabin, perhaps 10 feet square, personal quarters designed for extended occupancy. A narrow bed, a desk, built-in shelving, untouched for decades. The room was clearly Blackwell's true sanctuary, separate from the captain's quarters Mark had been using. Everything here was personal rather than official. Photographs on the walls showed a young girl, Blackwell's daughter, Mark assumed. A family that had existed before everything fell apart. On the desk sat an ornate chest, perhaps 2 feet long and intricately carved. Beside it, a sealed envelope with final instructions written across the front. Mark called Linda and Kenny. This felt too significant to open alone. They arrived within an hour, Linda bringing Irene and Gus as well. The 5 of them stood in the hidden cabin, Mark explaining how he'd found it. "Should we open the letter first?" Linda asked. Mark broke the seal carefully and read aloud. Blackwell's handwriting was shaky, clearly written much later than the other letter. "If you're reading this, you've found everything," it began. "The collections, the instruments, the charts. And now, my final secret. The chest contains what I valued most, gold coins from various eras, worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. They were my insurance, my emergency fund, the wealth I thought would guarantee my freedom." The letter continued, explaining how Blackwell had faked his death, used forged documents to escape to South America. He'd planned to eventually recover the collection, sell it, live comfortably abroad. "But I was never able to return," the letter read. "Investigators came close to finding me several times. I lived in fear, using assumed names, never staying anywhere long. The money in this chest could have funded a comfortable life, but accessing it would have exposed me. So it sat here, along with everything else I couldn't claim." Mark's voice grew quieter as he read the conclusion. "I died alone, estranged from my daughter, separated from everything I'd built. The investigation that frightened me so much was dropped after 5 years. I could have come home, faced limited consequences, rebuilt my life. But I didn't know that until too late. Fear trapped me more effectively than any prison. By the time you read this, I'll be long dead. The chest is yours, whoever you are. But learn from my mistakes. Wealth means nothing without integrity. Freedom means nothing without purpose. I spent my life accumulating treasures and died with nothing that mattered." Silence filled the cabin. Finally Gus spoke. "Man sure learned his lesson the hard way." Kenny examined the chest. "We need to open this carefully. There could be legal complications if it's as valuable as he suggests." Mark agreed. They carried the chest to the chart room, where there was better light and space. The lock was ornate, but not complex. It opened with an old key Mark found in the desk drawer. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were canvas bags. Mark lifted one out and loosened the drawstring. Gold coins spilled onto the table, gleaming despite decades of darkness. Irene gasped. "Those are American gold eagles, and British sovereigns, French Napoleons." She picked up coins from different bags. "He has collections from multiple countries, multiple eras. This isn't just money, it's numismatic treasure." Kenny's accounting mind kicked in. "We need immediate security, insurance, legal documentation. If the gold alone is worth what I think it is, we're talking millions." But Mark was reading more of the letter, a final page he'd initially missed. It detailed how Blackwell had acquired the coins legally, included purchase receipts from legitimate dealers. Everything documented, everything clean. "He wanted whoever found this to know it was honest money," Mark said. "Even at the end, that mattered to him." The next day brought lawyers, appraisers, and considerable legal complexity. Blackwell's faked death created unusual circumstances. His estate had been settled decades ago based on presumed death. His daughter, now in her 70s, had no legal claim to assets from a father legally declared dead before these coins were acquired. The maritime attorney Kenny had hired consulted with estate specialists. Their conclusion was clear but unsettling. Mark owned the chest and its contents as part of the ship's purchase. But the ethical implications were murkier. Legally, it's yours, the lawyer explained. Morally, you might consider what feels right. Mark contacted Blackwell's daughter, explained what they'd found. She asked for time to consider the situation. Her response came 3 days later in a thoughtful letter. She had no financial need, her mother's family had been wealthy, and she'd lived comfortably her entire life. What she wanted was truth and closure. "My father's choices destroyed our family," she wrote. "I spent my life believing he died heroically at sea. Learning he faked his death and abandoned us is painful. But it's also honest. Keep the coins. Use them for your museum. Let something good come from his mistakes. That would honor his memory better than any inheritance." She asked only to attend the opening, to see what her father's collection had become. Mark gathered his team, Linda, Kenny, Irene, Gus, and laid out his decision. "We inventory every coin, get them properly appraised, then we make a choice. Keep some of the most historically significant pieces for the museum's collection. Sell the rest to dramatically increase the endowment." "What about Blackwell's daughter?" Linda asked. "We establish a scholarship fund in her mother's name. Maritime education for students who couldn't otherwise afford it. She gets to decide the criteria." Kenny nodded slowly. "It's the right thing to do. Not legally required, but right." The appraisal took a week. The coin's value exceeded even optimistic estimates. Nearly $3 million in gold, some pieces rare enough to command premium prices from collectors. But the real treasure, Mark realized, wasn't in the chest. It was in the choice of what to do with it. Blackwell had learned too late that integrity mattered more than wealth. Mark had learned it just in time. The opening was now 5 days away. The ship gleamed with fresh restoration. Exhibits were mounted, lighting perfected, educational materials prepared. And now, unexpectedly, they had funding that would sustain the museum for generations. Mark stood in Blackwell's hidden cabin one last time before it was sealed as part of the historical tour. He placed the brass compass in a display case with both letters, the full story of Preston Blackwell's rise and fall. "True North," the compass read. Mark finally understood what it meant. Opening day arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature in the low 70s. Mark woke at dawn in the captain's quarters, his permanent home now, and lay listening to the familiar sounds of the ship, metal creaking, water lapping against the hull, seagulls calling over the harbour. 6 months had passed since he'd stood at this dock with $3,000 and a desperate decision. The journey from that moment to this one felt both impossibly long and startlingly brief. He dressed carefully in the navy blazer Linda had insisted he buy. "You're the face of this museum now," she'd said. "You need to look the part." Outside, the harbour was already busy. Volunteers were arriving, hanging maritime flags along the dock, setting up registration tables. The local Coast Guard detachment had sent an honour guard. News trucks were positioning for the ceremony. Kenny appeared with coffee and a clipboard. 280 confirmed attendees, another 50 walk-ups expected. Parking coordinated with the city. Security briefed. "We're ready." "I'm not sure I am," Mark admitted. "You'll be fine. Just speak from the heart, like you always do." Linda arrived next, wearing a dress the color of the ocean on a clear day. She carried a framed photograph. "I found this in Mom's things last night. Thought you might want it nearby today." The photo showed Claire on a sailboat, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Mark felt his throat tighten. She would have loved all this. She does, Linda said quietly. Wherever she is, she's proud of you. Irene swept through with last-minute details about the exhibits. The Maritime Museum director who'd authenticated the Shackleton chart was coming. A documentary crew had permission to film. Preston Blackwell's daughter had arrived yesterday and was staying at a local inn. I met her briefly, Irene said. Lovely woman. She asked if she could have a few private minutes aboard before the ceremony. Of course, Mark said immediately. At 9 o'clock, a taxi arrived at the dock. An elderly woman emerged, moving carefully but with dignity. Mark recognized her from photographs he'd found in Blackwell's cabin, the same eyes, the same elegant bearing. He met her at the gangway. Mrs. Ashford, I'm Mark Henderson. Please, call me Margaret. Her handshake was firm despite her age. Thank you for inviting me. This is more difficult than I expected. I understand. Would you like to see everything before the crowds arrive? She nodded gratefully. Mark led her through the ship slowly, explaining what they'd found and how they'd preserved it. In the chart room, she paused before the Shackleton map. My father loved exploration stories. He used to read them to me before bed. In the navigation instrument exhibit, she touched the glass case, holding the Harrison chronometer. He would have been so proud to see these properly displayed. He always said they deserved to be shared, not hidden. Then why did he hide them? Mark asked gently. Fear, pride, the mistakes that seemed small at first, but compounded until he saw no way out. Margaret turned to face him. My father wasn't a bad man, Mr. Henderson, but he made bad choices, and they cost him everything. His family, his reputation, his life. Mark showed her Blackwell's final letter and the brass compass. She read in silence, tears streaming down her weathered face. May I keep this? She held up the letter. It's yours. Along with the compass, if you'd like it. No. The compass belongs here, with the story you're telling, but I'd like the letter. It's the only honest communication I've had from my father in 60 years. They sat together in Blackwell's hidden cabin, now part of the museum tour, and talked about Preston Blackwell. Margaret shared memories of her childhood, the father who'd seemed larger than life before he disappeared. I'm creating a scholarship fund in your mother's name, Mark told her, from the proceeds of the coins your father left. I hope that's acceptable. Margaret smiled through tears. My mother would have loved that. She always believed education opened doors that wealth alone couldn't. At 10 o'clock, guests began arriving. The crowd swelled quickly, filling the dock and climbing the gangway in organized groups. Former sailors in dress uniforms, local families with excited children, history enthusiasts with cameras, reporters with notebooks. The Coast Guard, Honor Guard formed up, flags snapping in the breeze. A color guard presented maritime ensigns. The ceremony began. The mayor spoke about Port Clayton's heritage, how the city had grown alongside its harbor. The Maritime Museum director talked about the significance of the collection. Irene gave a passionate presentation about preserving history for future generations. Then it was Mark's turn. He stood at the podium they'd set up on the main deck, looking out at hundreds of faces. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his notes. Then he set them aside. 6 months ago, I stood on this dock, facing the worst moment of my life, he began. I'd lost my job, was about to lose my home, and felt like I'd failed at everything that mattered. I had $3,000 left and a choice to make. He told the story simply. The auction, the decision, his daughter's tears and his brother's anger. The first discoveries, the growing realization of what the ship contained. But here's what I learned, Mark continued. The treasure wasn't in the gold or the artifacts, it was in finding purpose again, in seeing my daughter's eyes light up when we discovered something new, in my brother going from thinking I was crazy to helping me build something meaningful. In this community, embracing a vision that seemed impossible. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Preston Blackwell spent his life accumulating treasures and died with nothing that mattered. He left us a warning in his final letter. Wealth means nothing without integrity. Freedom means nothing without purpose. This museum isn't about the money these artifacts represent. It's about what they teach us, about exploration and courage, about human ingenuity and the drive to understand our world, about learning from mistakes and choosing better paths. Mark's voice grew stronger. When I bought this ship, people thought I was desperate or foolish. Maybe I was both. But desperation and faith look surprisingly similar sometimes. You can't always tell them apart until you see where they lead. He looked directly at Linda, standing in the front row. My late wife used to say, "The universe sends us opportunities when we need them most. Most people are too afraid to recognize them." I was terrified when I made that bid. But I was also ready to trust something larger than my fear. The crowd was silent, attentive. Mark gestured to the ship around them. The Empress Catherine represents second chances. Preston Blackwell's chance to leave a better legacy than his mistakes. My chance to find purpose after losing my way. Port Clayton's chance to reconnect with its maritime heritage. And for everyone who visits here, a chance to learn that it's never too late to choose a better direction. He held up the brass compass that had been Preston Blackwell's final gift. True north, he engraved on this. Not wealth, not success, not even happiness, just direction, purpose, integrity. Mark's voice softened to a conclusion. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for believing in this vision. And thank you for proving that sometimes the craziest decisions turn out to be the wisest ones. The applause started slowly, then built to something overwhelming. People stood, and the sound echoed across the harbour. Linda cut the ribbon with Mark at her side, cameras flashing as the red fabric fell away. The crowd surged forward, eager to explore the ship they'd heard so much about. Mark stepped back, letting the museum volunteers guide visitors through the entrance. He'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times with Irene, ensuring smooth flow through the exhibits, groups of 20 at a time, staggered entries, clear pathways marked throughout the ship. The first visitors climbed aboard with reverence, many touching the freshly polished brass nameplate. Mark watched an elderly man pause there, his hand trembling as it made contact with the metal. "I remember when she sailed," the man said to no one in particular. "Finest ship I ever saw in this harbour." Inside, reactions exceeded anything Mark had imagined. Children pressed close to display cases, pointing at the ancient navigation instruments. Adults read exhibit placards with genuine interest, asking volunteers questions about maritime history. In the chart room, a retired geography teacher stood before the Shackleton map with tears streaming down her face. "I've taught about this expedition for 30 years, she told Mark. "Never thought I'd see something he actually touched." The navigation instrument gallery drew crowds around the Harrison chronometer. Irene had created an interactive display explaining how it revolutionized sea travel, allowing sailors to calculate longitude accurately for the first time. Before this invention, ships often got lost at sea, she explained to a group of middle schoolers. Thousands of sailors died because they couldn't determine their exact position. John Harrison's chronometer saved countless lives. Mark moved through the crowds quietly, observing reactions. In the captain's quarters, preserved exactly as he'd found them, visitors spoke in hushed tones as if entering a sacred space. The logbook lay open under glass, showing the final entry from 1958. But the exhibit that drew the most attention was Blackwell's story. Mark and Irene had wrestled with how to present it, a cautionary tale about choices and consequences, told with honesty but also compassion. The hidden cabin remained accessible, furnished as it had been. Display cases held the letters Blackwell had written, his confession and his warnings. The brass compass sat in its own case, spotlight illuminating the engraving, True North. Margaret Ashford stood before that exhibit for a long time. Mark approached her carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. "It's strange seeing my father's life reduced to museum displays," she said. "But you've been fair to him, shown his mistakes without making him a villain. I appreciate that. He gave us something valuable at the end, truth and warning. That deserves respect." A young couple approached Margaret hesitantly. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you related to Preston Blackwell?" Margaret nodded. "I'm his daughter. We just want to say thank you. The scholarship fund announcement, the one in your mother's name, our daughter received one. She's going to study marine biology because of it. We couldn't have afforded it otherwise." Margaret's composure cracked. She embraced the woman, both of them crying. Mark stepped away to give them privacy, his own eyes damp. Kenny found him on the main deck. "Initial feedback is extraordinary. People are already asking about membership programs, educational workshops, group tours. This is going to be successful beyond anything we projected." "Good. That means it'll last. More than last, it'll grow. I've had 3 inquiries about major donations already. People want to support this." Linda appeared with a group of her former students, 3rd graders wide-eyed with excitement. "Mr. Henderson, these are my kids. Can you tell them about finding the treasure?" Mark knelt down to their level. "Well, the real treasure wasn't the gold or the maps. The real treasure was learning that it's okay to take chances when you believe in something." A small girl raised her hand. "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Mark admitted. "But sometimes being scared means you're doing something important." The day progressed with seamless efficiency, volunteers guiding groups, answering questions, managing the steady flow of visitors. The documentary crew captured candid moments, children discovering navigation tools, adults marveling at historic charts, Margaret sharing memories with visitors. Gus, in his vintage captain's uniform, became an instant favorite. He stood at the ship's wheel, telling stories about the golden age of ocean travel, his weathered hands gesturing as he described storms weathered and ports visited. "Ships like this were built to last," he told a rapt audience, "not just structurally, but in memory. They carried dreams across oceans, connected continents, changed the world." By late afternoon, the initial rush had settled into steady traffic. Mark found a quiet moment on the stern deck, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Linda joined him. "Successful day. Beyond what I imagined. Mum would have loved seeing this. All these people learning, discovering, being inspired." Mark nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "You know what the best part is?" Linda continued. "You didn't just save yourself, you created something that'll help people for generations. Kids who'll learn about exploration and courage, families who'll make memories here, students who'll get scholarships because a flawed man left resources to help them." "I just bought a ship," Mark said quietly. "No, Dad, you saw potential where everyone else saw rust. You believed when belief seemed crazy. You chose purpose over profit. That's not luck, that's character." The evening reception brought together everyone who'd made the museum possible. Volunteers, donors, city officials, historical society members. They gathered on the deck as the sun set, glasses raised in celebration. The mayor presented Mark with a ceremonial key to the city for vision, courage, and service to Port Clayton's heritage. Kenny gave a toast about redemption and second chances. Irene spoke about preserving history for the future. Margaret shared memories of her father's love for the sea and expressed gratitude that his mistakes hadn't defined his final legacy. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he simply said, "Thank you for believing in an impossible idea. Thank you for helping turn a desperate gamble into something meaningful. And thank you for proving that community and purpose matter more than individual success." As the party wound down and guests departed, Mark stood alone at the bow. The harbour lights reflected on calm water. The city spread out before him, familiar and welcoming. His phone buzzed. A text from Linda. "Proud of you, Dad. Mom is too." Mark touched the railing, felt the solid steel beneath his hands. 6 months ago, this ship had been a crazy risk. Now it was home, purpose, legacy. He thought about Blackwell's compass and its simple message: true north, not a direction on a map, but a principle to live by. Integrity, purpose, community. Mark had found his direction, not despite his desperation, but because of it. Sometimes you had to risk everything to discover what truly mattered. The ship creaked gently beneath him, settling into the evening. Mark smiled, turned toward the captain's quarters, and headed home. The museum thrived beyond anyone's projections. Within the first month, over 2,000 visitors walked through the Empress Catherine's decks. School groups booked tours months in advance. Weekend workshops on maritime history filled to capacity. The local economy felt the impact as tourists explored Port Clayton, ate at restaurants, stayed in hotels. Mark settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. His mornings began with coffee on deck, watching the harbour wake up. He'd ring the ship's bell at 8 o'clock, signalling the museum's opening. The brass bell, engraved Empress Catherine 1949, had been restored to gleaming beauty and mounted near the entrance. Linda's educational programs exceeded expectations. She'd created age-appropriate tours for different grade levels, hands-on navigation workshops, even summer camps where children learned celestial navigation and maritime skills. Her teaching gift had found perfect expression in this larger classroom. Kenny managed the non-profit with meticulous attention. The endowment grew through careful investment and generous donations. Operating costs stayed within budget. The scholarship fund in Margaret Ashford's mother's name awarded its first grants, 5 students pursuing maritime studies, marine biology, or naval architecture. Irene's historical research continued, uncovering layers of the Empress Catherine's story. She'd found passenger manifests showing who'd travelled aboard during the glory years. Photographs emerged from private collections. Former crew members contacted the museum with memories and artifacts. Gus became the museum's heart, greeting visitors with genuine warmth, sharing stories that made history feel alive. Children especially loved him, gathering around as he demonstrated how sailors used sextants or explained how to read weather from cloud formations. But Mark's favorite moments came during quiet mornings before the museum opened, when he walked through the exhibits alone. Each artifact represented not just history but possibility. Objects hidden for decades now, teaching thousands. 3 months after opening, Mark received an unexpected visitor. A representative from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History requested a meeting. They sat in what had become Mark's office, the restored first-class lounge, with a desk positioned near the portholes. "Mr. Henderson, we've been following your museum's success with great interest," the representative began. "The collection you've preserved is nationally significant." Mark listened as she outlined possibilities. The Smithsonian could provide expertise, authentication services, traveling exhibits. In return, the Empress Catherine would loan select pieces for major exhibitions, sharing the collection with audiences worldwide. "We're particularly interested in the Harrison chronometer and the Shackleton chart," she continued. "These pieces deserve the widest possible audience." Mark considered carefully. "The artifacts stay here permanently, but we could create replicas for travel, share the stories without depleting our collection." The representative smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thoughtful stewardship we hope to find. We can work with that approach." The partnership opened new doors. Smithsonian experts helped develop enhanced educational materials. Grant funding supported expansion of the scholarship program. The Empress Catherine's name spread beyond Port Clayton, becoming known among maritime historians and museum professionals. But success brought challenges. The constant stream of visitors meant wear on the ship's restored spaces. Maintenance costs exceeded initial projections. Security concerns increased as the collection's value became widely known. One evening, Mark gathered his core team, Linda, Kenny, Irene, and Gus, to discuss sustainability. "We're successful, which creates new pressures," Mark began. "We need to plan for the long term, not just next year, but the next 50 years. Kenny presented financial projections. "We're stable currently, but growth requires capital investment. Climate control upgrades, accessibility improvements, expanded exhibit space. What if we started a Friends of the Empress Catherine membership program?" Linda suggested. "Annual memberships with benefits. People who want to support the mission ongoing." Irene added, "We could also pursue corporate sponsorships, maritime companies, shipping firms, educational organizations." They worked late into the evening, planning the museum's future. The conversation reminded Mark of those early days with the blueprints, mapping hidden compartments. Now they were mapping sustainability and growth. Margaret Ashford became an unexpected ally. She visited quarterly, always spending time at her father's exhibit. On her third visit, she approached Mark with a proposal. "I've been thinking about my father's legacy," she said. "I have resources and no children of my own. I'd like to establish a trust that supports this museum in perpetuity." Mark started to protest, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. My father's mistakes cost him his family and his life, but they also created this opportunity for something good. I want to ensure that good continues long after we're both gone." Her trust fund added $2 million to the endowment, guaranteeing the museum's financial foundation for generations. The first anniversary celebration drew even larger crowds than opening day. The ship had become a Port Clayton landmark, featured in travel guides and maritime publications. Local schools incorporated museum visits into their curricula. Universities sent architecture students to study the ship's Art Deco design. Mark stood at the podium again, preparing to address the anniversary gathering. He thought about the journey from desperate single father to museum founder. The transformation still felt surreal. "A year ago, we opened this museum with hope and uncertainty," he began. "Today, I can report that 23,000 people have walked these decks. 500 school groups have learned about maritime history here. 5 students are pursuing their dreams because of scholarship support. And this ship that was left to rot has become a living classroom." He paused, gathering emotion. "But the real success isn't measured in numbers. It's measured in the 8-year-old girl who told me she wants to be a marine biologist now. The retired sailor who cried when he saw the navigation instruments. The family who drove 6 hours because their grandfather served on ships like this one. Those moments matter more than any attendance record." The audience applauded, but Mark continued. "Preston Blackwell's letter warned that wealth without purpose is meaningless. This museum proves the opposite, that purpose can transform even mistakes into meaning. Every visitor here validates that truth." As the celebration continued, Mark found Linda on the main deck. "Happy?" she asked. "Grateful," he corrected. "There's a difference. Mom used to say, 'Gratitude is the secret to contentment.'" Mark smiled. "Your mother was wise about many things." They stood together watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and orange, the same colors that had illuminated the rusted ship that desperate morning 6 months ago. The Empress Catherine had been transformed, but so had Mark. He'd found more than treasure in those hidden compartments. He'd found himself again. The ship's bell rang, signaling the museum's closing. But for Mark, each ending was simply preparation for tomorrow's beginning. The journey continued, guided by the simple wisdom of a brass compass. True north, always. Winter settled over Port Clayton with the gentle insistence of the season. Morning frost decorated the ship's railings. The harbor took on a quieter character, though visitors still came steadily, drawn by the museum's growing reputation. Mark's daily routine had become ritual. Wake before dawn, coffee brewed in the small galley he'd installed in the captain's quarters. Step onto the deck, wrapped in a wool coat, breath misting in the cold air. Watch the sun rise over water that reflected the sky in shades of silver and pearl. Then, precisely at 7:30, he'd ring the ship's bell. The sound carried across the harbour, a declaration that another day of discovery awaited. The museum had evolved beyond his initial vision. Educational programs now served 3 counties. The scholarship fund had expanded to support 10 students annually. Traveling exhibits shared pieces of the collection with museums nationwide. The Smithsonian Partnership brought experts who helped develop interactive displays that made history tangible for children. Linda had accepted a permanent position as education director, leaving her teaching job with both sadness and excitement. "I'm still teaching," she told Mark, "just on a bigger scale." She'd also started bringing someone to family dinners. A marine biologist named Christopher, who worked at the nearby research station. Mark liked him immediately, appreciated how he looked at Linda with quiet devotion. Kenny's accounting firm now managed several maritime heritage non-profits inspired by his work with the Empress Catherine. He discovered unexpected passion for preservation and education, bringing business acumen to organizations that needed it. Irene had published a book about Preston Blackwell and the ship's history, donating all proceeds to the museum endowment. It became a regional bestseller, bringing new visitors curious about the story. Gus, now 83, still volunteered 3 days weekly. His stories had been recorded for the museum's archives, ensuring his knowledge and personality would endure. On a particularly cold February morning, Mark received a letter from Margaret Ashford. Her handwriting had grown shakier, but the message was clear. "Dear Mark, I'm writing to let you know I'm moving to Port Clayton permanently. At my age, I want to be near the one place that honors my father's better angels. I hope that's acceptable." Mark called her immediately. "More than acceptable. We'd be honored." She arrived in March, settling into a cottage near the harbour. She became a regular presence at the museum, volunteering in the archives, sharing memories with visitors who wanted to understand Preston Blackwell beyond the exhibits. Her presence completed something Mark hadn't realized was incomplete. The museum wasn't just preserving artifacts, it was honoring complex human stories, acknowledging that people contained both mistakes and redemption. Spring brought new developments. A documentary about the ship premiered on a national history channel, bringing international attention. Inquiries arrived from Japan, England, Australia, people fascinated by the story of hidden treasure and second chances. But Mark's greatest joy came from small moments: a child's wonder at touching a ship's wheel, a veteran's tears while viewing navigation instruments, a young couple getting engaged on the deck, where Mark had once stood desperate and alone. One afternoon, Linda found him in Blackwell's hidden cabin, now permanently incorporated into the museum tour. "Thinking about the old days?" she asked. "Thinking about how far we've come. A year ago, I was sleeping in my car, wondering how I'd failed so completely. And now? Now I understand that sometimes what feels like failure is just preparation for something better." Linda sat beside him. "I have news. Christopher and I are engaged." Mark felt joy surge through him. "That's wonderful. Your mother would be so happy. I wanted to ask, would you walk me down the aisle, and could we have the reception here, on the ship?" Mark pulled her into an embrace. "Nothing would make me prouder." The wedding took place in June, on the main deck, with the harbour as backdrop. Margaret attended, as did Kenny's family, Irene, Gus, and half of Port Clayton. The ship was decorated with maritime flags and flowers that caught the breeze. As Mark walked Linda down the makeshift aisle, he thought about Claire. She'd raised this remarkable woman for 20 years before cancer took her. Linda's strength, compassion, and vision all reflected her mother's influence. "She's here." "You know," Linda whispered as they walked. "Mum, I can feel her." "I know," Mark whispered back. "She's been here all along." The reception lasted into the evening. Music played, guests danced, children ran across the deck that had once been covered in rust. Mark stood at his familiar spot at the bow, watching the celebration. Kenny joined him. "You did good, brother. Not just with the ship, with everything. We did good. You, Linda, Irene, Gus. This was never just me. Maybe. But you took the crazy risk that made it all possible. That takes courage most people don't have." After guests departed, Mark remained on deck. The ship creaked gently, settling into familiar nighttime sounds. Lights from Port Clayton reflected on calm water. Stars emerged as darkness deepened. He thought about the journey from that desperate morning to this peaceful evening, the terror of spending his last money, the first discoveries in hidden compartments, Linda's transformation from worried daughter to confident museum director, Kenny's evolution from skeptic to supporter, the community embracing a vision that had seemed impossible. Most of all, he thought about purpose. For years after Claire's death, he'd defined himself by work and responsibility. When work disappeared, he'd felt erased, valueless, lost. The Empress Catherine had given him something to build that mattered beyond personal success. She'd taught him that treasure wasn't always gold or artifacts. Sometimes, treasure was the courage to risk everything on an impossible bet. Sometimes it was the community that rallied around a shared vision. Sometimes it was watching your daughter marry a good man on the deck of a ship you'd saved from oblivion. Mark pulled out the brass compass he kept in his pocket, Blackwell's final gift. True North, the engraving read. He'd found his direction, not through certainty or planning, but through desperate faith and stubborn hope. The ship's bell rang, moved by the wind. Mark smiled at the sound that marked time's passage and continuity's promise. Tomorrow, the museum would open again. Students would learn, visitors would marvel, history would speak to the present. The Empress Catherine would continue her journey, no longer crossing oceans, but navigating something more important, the space between past and future, between mistakes and redemption, between desperation and purpose. Mark touched the polished brass nameplate one final time, a gesture of gratitude and connection. Then he turned toward the captain's quarters, toward home, toward whatever adventures tomorrow might bring. The ship held steady beneath him, and Mark Henderson, once desperate single father, now museum founder and grandfather-to-be, knew exactly where he belonged.